Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone here. Happy Women's Day to all of you. My name is Surya Narayanan, and I'm one of the GBF ambassadors. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to join today's discussion on reimagining leadership and capital in the post-pandemic world. We have scientists, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders join us from US to New Zealand, and I'm sure the discussion will be insightful and inspiring. So before we go further, I do want to let all of you know that this session is recorded and everyone is muted. However, you will have a chance to connect with the panelists post the panel discussion. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, post any comments, share any interesting links, and shoot your questions. We want to keep this session as interactive as possible. So I want to introduce you to Global Bio Fund and GBX before we start the roundtable. Global Bio Fund is a value capital fund with a gender smart lens in the intersection of biosectors such as health and well-being, food and agriculture, energy and environment. At Global Bio Fund, we invest in and scale women-led bio ventures at early and growth stages, especially in the US, UK, and Australasia. GBX is our network of 1,500 plus diverse and experienced group of investors, entrepreneurs, scientists, and experts that support women-led ventures that are growth and impact oriented. So you can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. So you can see the chat box for the links. I think Ipshita is posting all the links. So I've been a part of GBF since last year. I personally aspire to be an entrepreneur and a leader. My role model is Kiran Mazumdar-Shah, who started one of India's first female-led biotech companies called Biocon. Biocon is a multinational firm which started out of her garage in Bangalore, that is my home city in India, back in 1970s. Today, it's valued at $4.9 billion. So like many in the audience, I'm so excited to learn from all our panelists on how, like Kiran, they could create a path for themselves despite all odds. Without further ado, I want to pass on this floor to our GBS founding partner, Ipshita, and the CEO, that is Ipshita Mandal Johnson, to introduce the topic and kick off the roundtable discussion.
Many thanks, Surya. And I have to say, Kiran's also been my motivation and inspiration as I kicked off my biotechnology studies a few years back. But many greetings and happy International Women's Day. It is brilliant to see so many familiar names and people who inspire me now with our work, and also people we work with quite closely. Before I went into introducing the theme, I did want to share why we picked the topics leadership and capital, because by themselves, you could probably have conferences on these two themes. It was basically, in some way, the motivation for us to build Global Bio Fund, and stemmed from one of my personal experiences in this journey. A few years back, I was working with a group of women entrepreneurs in St. Lucia. They were building an ag tech business. They were women farmers who were building their first startup ever. And looking through their journey, not only in terms of the skills and capabilities they needed to build, but how foreign it all seemed sometimes for them in terms of the lack of leadership models, not just women entrepreneurs in their community, but also stepping up to any women business leaders, but also what capital meant to them, because it wasn't just an investment into their startup. For them, their responsibility towards their community and society, and how they thought about nature and environment around their country, St. Lucia, they often felt the typical finance investor didn't care about a lot of those things. This is one of the stories amongst many through my experience working as a scientist or in entrepreneurship or with corporates, where I've personally seen the gap in values for inclusion and impact. In some way, this gap has widened or being talked about more during the COVID-19 crisis. It has compelled many to rethink what makes a good leader, and also what is the impact of an organization towards society and environment. Currently, we are looking at unprecedented change. There's so many political changes taking place, and we are currently going through climate change itself. The rate of this change is also accelerating, and as leaders, as entrepreneurs, and as scientists, we have an opportunity to rethink what it means to be an effective leader, and also how we develop these leaders. So here today on International Women's Day with our GBX network, we have an opportunity to think about with our women tech leaders, our investors and entrepreneurs, but also our male allies and advocates, which Claire from our panel will talk about in a bit, what it means, these issues on leadership and capital. You'll see there's a poll that Surya's kicked off on as we're looking at post-pandemic challenges. What do you feel is important? What amongst these two topics, leadership or capital? It will help us focus our conversation in this panel discussion as well. Moving towards, as we've talked about leadership a fair bit, I'd also want to talk about capital briefly. A lot of successful leaders have strong values that inspire and guide their decisions. And so much so, values-based decision-making has become a course in Harvard's Business School's MBA program, where it goes into the moral imperatives or a social contract that business leaders need to engage on for public good problems. Especially in the last decade, and Monique's been an expert in impact investing and she can share some of this stuff, but the growth of capital for investing beyond financial returns, but also being quite quantitative towards impact investing, which is even deeper than just thinking about environmental, social, and governance issues, has, I would say, accelerated as a theme and topic in the last 2 years during the pandemic as well. Let's look at our poll and see, between these two topics of leadership and capital, what would you like us to focus on? So there's a lot of interest on leadership, which is brilliant, because we are on International Women's Day and we want to think about diverse leaders, both women leaders, but also diverse ethnic leaders. But good to see that interest on capital too, which will help us shape the discussion today. With that, I will get on to the panel itself. And it is my privilege and just humbling, actually, to be introducing these set of people for this discussion today. Andrew, Monique, and Claire are first of all wonderful people, but secondly, so illustrious in their experience in their respective sectors. If that's financial services and banking, if that's in biotechnology and life sciences, if that's in venture capital and consulting, but also the widespread of geographic experience all three of you have will add a lot of value to this discussion. Unlike other panels where we go into 10 minutes introducing all our distinctive credibilities and things, I would ask Surya and the GBF team to share some of your LinkedIn and Twitter profiles into the chat box, because people can see how many amazing things you have been part of. But we'll kick off the discussion with a question. what radicalizes you? What has been a turning point in your professional career that has made you rethink leadership and/or capital? So with that, let's bring the panelists in, and we could probably kick off the discussion with Monique.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation. I'm honored to be here with all of you. So as I reflected on this particular question, I thought about what do I need to say that's different from my usual bio, which you'll have shortly in the chat from LinkedIn. So I think that there wasn't a specific turning point, and I want to just kind of offer up that this was a bit of a journey. And as the poet Machado says, the path was made by walking. So in some ways, I was born into this because I'm a Black woman in America, the daughter of immigrants from a country that was once colonized. My path to radical thought, if we call it radical thought, that we need to make justice normal, was revealed to me over time. And the need to do so, of course, has always been there. And in this work, I stand on the shoulder of giants. Learning the real history of America, the Caribbean, and the world radicalized me. Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States, W.E.B. Du Bois' book, Black Reconstruction in America, these things radicalized me. Learning the truth. I named my podcast that I hosted last year, The Reconstruction, whose tagline was Moving Capital Towards Justice. And Dr. Pshita was one of my guests of that podcast. It was the chance that America had to almost get a racial democracy right. What can we learn that get it this in the post-COVID recovery time that we have, when we know that recoveries from disaster often exacerbate existing inequalities. But it's also observations of inequality, both cities and here in the United States where I'm based, and in my travels to Jamaica, where my family is from, and other places around the world in my young adulthood. Those jarring juxtapositions of the haves and have-nots that I saw, that we can still see every day, of course, where it looks like in the Caribbean, lean-to dwellings built on the side of a concrete wall, that's someone's massive mansion that's topped with barbed wire on a random street. These things were troubling to me. Georgetown University radicalized me. I studied at the School of Foreign Service in undergrad, SFS, Safe from Science, as we called it. The irony, of course, is not lost on me that I'm speaking to a room full of scientists, health experts, and technologies. And while I wasn't required to take organic chemistry, I was required to take courses in philosophy and theology, and a class called Map of the Modern World, where we had to know all the countries of the world and their former colonizer, and the history of the world's many conflicts. I took courses there in Black liberation theology and Africana studies. My time in finance as the only Black woman in the room most of the time radicalized me. To my knowledge, I was the only Black woman in front office on the trading floor in sales and trading anywhere in the world at my former employer, which was a global investment bank. The blatant sexism and racism I both witnessed and experienced during my 15 years in finance radicalized me. The micro and macro aggressions I experienced, the rampant sexual harassment, that former guy in 2016 in America radicalized me. That was a turning point for so many of us in the US, because, and it certainly turned up the volume on my commitment to being on the right side of history, because look what we almost did to be here facing with a leader like that. So I hold close the quote, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening," because that tells you everything you need to know. The near collapses of so many systems during the pandemic, incalculable and avoidable human tragedy, radicalized me even more. Near the beginning of the pandemic, I read the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, which may have changed my life. And I'll just share a brief excerpt because I think it really crystallizes it. Imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future of a given geography. We are living in the ancestral imagination of others with their longing for safety and abundance, a longing that didn't include us. We are living inside the imagination of people who thought economic disparity and environmental destruction were acceptable costs for their power. It is our right and our responsibility to write ourselves into the future. The book goes on in so many other ways, but I think that was a galvanizing moment for me. America's founding fathers did not imagine me being able to read, never mind have a job, run a company, lead a fund. In 2018, Harvard Business Review found that there were more CEOs named John among large US companies than women. Whose imagination was that? 115 Supreme Court justices in the United States, 108 have been white men. If Ketanji Brown Jackson is confirmed, she'll be the first Black woman to sit on the highest court in the land. I'm sure she was not the first who was qualified. Women senators in the United States got a bathroom nearby where they work in the 90s. The original architects of those buildings never imagined that women would be senators. Did you know that only 5% of children's books have characters that are Latinx? In the United States, this is the fastest growing population, and only 5% of the books reflect that group. How does that make sense? Whose imagination does that represent? Which of these is a painful chronic condition that could lead to life-threatening blood clots, erectile dysfunction, or endometriosis? Which of these problems occupies more space in the pharmaceutical industry, and why do you think that is? This lack of imagination is deadly for women of all ethnicities, for Black people and other people of color, not only in an existential sense related to power and worthiness, but literally. My ongoing journey to greater radicalization leads me to the questions: who was the world designed for and by whom? Because those who created a world that would for them, not for. We see the results of these imaginations. Largely white men in the global north designed the systems and structures that we have today, particularly in the financial markets. We have the outputs of all those ideas all around us. Look at the latest IPCC report. The stuff that used to be called externalities, the stuff that folks didn't bother to count or take responsibility for, some of that we can call climate change. Their blind spots and lack of imagination and the resulting market failures, systems fragility, definitely harms and sometimes kills us, women of all ethnicities and Black people and other people of color. This is not hyperbole. Their imaginations have people fighting wars they did not ask for, fighting to have their voices heard and respected in a democracy, fighting not to be subjugated due to their gender, ethnicity, or religion, or because they're LGBTQIA, or because they happen to be children. There are 40 million people worldwide in some form of modern slavery. 70% of them are women and children. Refugees and immigrants are particularly vulnerable. And the number of global refugees just increased by another 1.5 million since the Russian invasion. I find that the people not radicalized right now are simply not paying attention, or they're in a position of privilege, which allows them to avert their gaze and attention from the real things that are happening right now to our lives and the planet. I am radicalized because I want the world to be better for my precious little Black son who is in preschool right now. That radicalizes me daily. So in closing, I ask, why isn't justice and systems thinking normal and linear thinking and injustice the aberration?
Monique, those words are deep and powerful, and I'm sure many of us in the audience are thinking about many of the issues you've raised there, and thinking about what radicalizes us, what change do we want to bring through our work. I'll pass on the mic, the virtual Zoom mic that we still have, to Andrew to share his unique experiences, because often on International Women's Day, I think the number of panels we have of purely a lot of women talking about inequality and issues that we face, I think it's quite important to have someone who walks the talk on this every day. So I'll pass on to you, Andrew, to share what brought you to, I mean, I don't know if you did this consciously or unconsciously, but what radicalized you into a different type of capital and leadership, what that means to you.
Well, thank you, Ipshita. I'm glad you introduced it like that about the panels, because I worried a lot when you invited me that I didn't belong here. I'm definitely from the Pale Male and Stale Brigade, and I had to defer a lot to your judgment, which I always listened to when it came to the role I could play. But when you then also posed a question beforehand about radicalization, it really worried me even more, because I worried that I'm not radicalized. I worry that I'm actually just trying to do the things that are obvious. And if I had to find an answer, and I did scrabble around to try and find an answer to that question, Ipshita, it was actually that it probably started because my parents were very lucky to give me a very good brain and not a lot of ego. And that meant that I approached the world in a very observational manner, and I was looking always around me at how it worked, and I guess at how I could make it work better, and how things should be, rather than how things were, how things should be. I had the very good fortune to partner up with a woman, a strong woman, many years ago, who always calls it out. To this day, she always calls it out. We've been together 40 some years now. And that calling out was a constant refrain in my adult life around, oh yeah, I guess I see that now. And I wonder what I could do about it. And so without being consciously radical at all, I've just tried to figure out how to make things better and how to make things work. And then the real grounding came, I guess, the thing that got me to your attention and to this table was that I observed in business and in finance and in the high levels of company life, I observed again and again and again the marginalization of the very smart woman that was sitting beside me, whoever it was. And I realized that there were things I could do about that. And they might sound weird things, but things like averting my gaze when I was the one being talked to constantly by the person on the other side of the table. Things like positioning myself in the room so that somebody couldn't just have a one-on-one conversation with me left to right and exclude everyone else. I had to sit on the other side of the table. There are a whole lot of little things which I now understand you've picked up on, Ipshita, and I now also understand that that's part of what makes me an unusual representative in this panel and an unusual representative today. Final comment, I guess, is that instead of focusing on gender, I've realized that my actual focus is on power. You've made me understand that just in the last little while. And when I say on power, what I mean is I'm as focused on the imbalances and abuses of power as I am about gender. As my kids would say, an overdeveloped sense of fairness, you know, that sometimes is my worst enemy, but it's actually, it is who I am. And I guess it's part of the way that I'm going to live my life and hopefully to a positive effect on things like International Women's Day.
Something for us to think about on the power, the privilege and power, and we'll talk about that later in the discussion as well, on how there's often been a talk of sharing that power with other people, and people feel that's something you give up, or is that something you grow by sharing your power? That's a philosophical question. We'll keep it for later. Last but not the least, we have an international football player and biotech leader from UK joining us here as well. You can see Claire's amazing shoe collection, but she's hidden away her football shoes. I see again.
You don't want to see them; they're filthy. These ones are beautiful. The football boots are not to be shown in public. Hi, I'm Claire Thompson. I'm CEO of Agility Life Sciences. So a little bit about me, and then I'll talk about what radicalized me. Just to give you a bit of a background. For me, CEO means captain, extrovert, optimist. So as you said, I'm a former footballer. I still coach a bit, and there's a reason for that. I'm here to get the best, not the most, out of my team. I'm always thinking about how to motivate, how to get the heads up, when their heads are down, how to keep that momentum going. I'm very focused on people and purpose rather than products and profits. And that's something that's really kind of come to the fore throughout the pandemic, and something that we're really, really focused on, we're passionate about. Now, I have had much more sexism in sport than I ever had in my career. I had 20 years in the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma all the way down to virtual biotech. That doesn't mean that I haven't had any in pharma. I have had instances of that, but from a very small age, I've had boys and women tell me, you can't play football, women can't play football. And that made me more persistent, if not belligerent. So I've seen it throughout my life. In my career, I've witnessed this, senior exec in a large pharma company who'd just come into the company. He was a medic. I asked him what he practiced, just having a general social conversation. And he said, well, I'm a gynecologist, but don't ask me to give you an examination. And all the men in the room laughed. And I'm like, in what way is that appropriate? I'm 25. It's not an appropriate thing to say whether I'm 25, 65, ridiculous. Now, thankfully, that gentleman did not stay in the business for very long, but it's just a prime example of the things he's clearly got away with this for so long. Ludicrous. And it can be quite overt. I've seen a number of more passive things that people have got away with, but I guess we're on limited time this evening to go through all the examples that we've seen of sexism. But what really brought this home for me was when my daughter was born, the insistence of people to ask, oh, is it a boy or a girl? We didn't do the whole blue and pink thing because frankly, it's bobbins. I'll keep the language clean. It's absolute bobbins. But people want to know, is it a boy or is it a girl? So that they can treat them differently. It's absolutely ludicrous. And as soon as she was born, I made her a promise that I would do everything within my power to ensure that she wasn't defined by her looks or confined by her gender. She normally joins events like this. I've just about got her to bed. She might make an appearance. But it's even since then, she's already got kids telling her at school that she's 5, that she can't do things because she's a girl. Quite frankly, it's infuriating that we're still at this point. It's ridiculous. So I'm a big believer that equality, like charity, begins at home. We need to start with these future leaders and teach the girls that they can be anything that they like. Teach the boys that girls can be anything that they like. And I said at the start that I started to do some football coaching at the school. This is as a direct result of some kids telling my daughter that she couldn't do things because she's a girl. Rather than me fighting parents in the playground, which what it could lead to, I've decided that I will coach the team, coach the kids. Most of them boys, some of them girls. They can see that girls certainly can play football. And if the boys can see that, and the girls can see that, and it gives the girls a role model to aspire to, and it breaks the bias that the boys see. If we can do that with sport, I can go in and do some science with them. That can be hopefully embraced, and they can carry that with them. They can take it home, break some of those biases themselves. So what I'm trying to build is confidence in the girls, and also future advocates like Andrew. And you're getting a lot of love in the chat, Andrew, for just being here. I think that men as allies isn't a strong enough term. That mallies term, it's just too soft. It's too passive. I would really love to see more men as advocates. I want more Andrews, please. I want more folk who are overtly focused on fairness. Diversity doesn't happen by its own. Equality doesn't happen by its own. We need to design it, build it within our organizations, within our communities. So diversity by design is part and parcel of what I do within my organization as well. So all of the roles are advertised as part-time or full-time, so that we are fully inclusive in abilities, in caring responsibilities. And if I have a shortlist panel within my team, they bring it to me of anything, I send it away. I'm not interested in an all-white shortlist or an all-female shortlist. Please bring me more diversity. We need to be inclusive from the very, very start.
I've loved that term advocate, Claire, though I have to say my husband was pointing out that madvocate also sounds like he's mad. And I think you probably have to be a little mad and off the spectrum these days to be a
well, as you know, as women we're called hysterical, so I think it's probably okay for men to be called mad.
Well, I'll probably start a question, and I'd love people in the audience. There's some.
Before you ask your question, Ipshita, I just want to add one thing to your comment, Claire. I read something lovely the other day about the genderizing so early of children and what that means. Again, the point about being able to treat people differently as soon as you know, right? Because it automatically changes even the tone of voice that people use. This woman said that she wanted to dress her child like a dinosaur all the time, with a little dinosaur suit with the scales across the back, and people would say, "Oh, what is it?" And she'd say, "A dinosaur," and walk away.
It's a diplodocus, didn't you know?
It's a dinosaur. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm. I'll kick off a question, but we are halfway through, and I knew this was going to be running quite fast. And I've got a bunch of questions for people, but more importantly, I know there are some awesome people here in the audience. There are people who are CEOs, people who are former CEOs. There are fund managers and people from the banking industry. There are scientists, there are entrepreneurs. And I think it would be lacking if we didn't have your thoughts and your questions. So what I'd love is I post this question. If you start thinking of something that you'd like to ask and discuss today, what we'll do is we'll unmute you and ask you to pose the question directly. And I also introduce yourself as you do that. I know there's been such good introductions on the chat box, but nothing better than a face behind the introduction. I think on discussions like International Women's Day, there is a talk of bias. There is a talk of need for different leadership styles. I'm conscious you can talk about it a lot, and in some ways, money and capital drives a lot of that change. So what I'd like the panel to consider here is, how do they see the role of financial institutions and venture capital funds and fund of funds to bring some of this change? Not just for the change towards alternative leadership models. I think we've got some bigger problems to address as entrepreneurs and leaders in solutions that we're creating. I think if that is sustainable food, if that is access to healthcare, new health technologies, if that is solutions towards climate change, how are you seeing capital shifting? What do you see the role of capital? What do we need to be doing differently? So I'll just keep this as an open question and see which one of you wants to take that up first.
Well, I'll hop in, and because I wanted to flag something just even about the question. And when we think about alternative, what is the normal by which we're defining? So when we think about the word diversity, diverse from what? That already starts to frame who is centered and who is normalized in those conversations. So let's just start there. But Andrew mentioned earlier the importance of noticing and addressing power. Capital is a proxy for power. Who gets to administer it, distribute it, decide things about it? And I want to offer up, in addition to this idea that capital is a proxy for power, risk is cultural. And we often think of risk as potentially something that is abstract, bloodless, just, a financial market output. But people decided, what is risk relative to what? What is riskier relative to what? And if women are riskier relative to men, are people of color riskier relative to white people? Why would that be the case? We have a lot to unpack if we think about things in terms of capital as a proxy for power and risk is cultural. We have to take a critical eye to the capital distribution systems as built, because again, they were built by people, designed for people to ensure that certain people got things from it. Be it government or venture capital industry. And to go one step further, even Reverend Barber says budgets are moral documents. How capital is allocated tells you something about what that group values and finds worthy. So when we look at the data with respect to who gets capital and who gets allocated, who gets funded, who gets appropriately funded and not underfunded, if we just look at over and under indexing as just something to notice, so that tells us that something happened. So if we say that talent is equally distributed, why does not the funding reflect that? The over and under tells you something happened, and that something is often bias. And then that bias gets built into the systems and structures, and that tells you what is normalized. So we are not outraged by these numbers. It's because they are now normal to us. We expect it, and we are actually only mildly pleased when they're not as abysmal as they used to be. And all of that should not be normal.
Let me hop in next, Ipshita, with a fairly deep background in capital. The issue that you're asking about, and Monique has given me the perfect frame, because I love this concept. We're living in the imaginations of our ancestors. In terms of capital, we are absolutely living in a capital structure system that is equally dominated like the Supreme Court bench in the USA. It's dominated by historic ways of thinking. And it is an interaction, as to use my own theme before, of power and capital, as Monique also pointed out. But the interaction means that decisions are made with that biased lens. And we can only break that down if we actually open our mind up to how it could work differently. I said before that I'd seen lots of examples, and many of them have been around the investment committee table, where you can observe on a daily basis the way in which questions are asked and the way in which answers are perceived differently from women to men. And if we have that old boys club operating at that level, unfortunately, because of the lag phase of age and experience, it means that today's capital structures are still dominated, and we might almost need that generational change for it to go away. I hate to think that, but in the meantime, the more we can both agitate and understand that insidious or subtle bias that occurs, not so subtle, that bias that occurs around the table on a daily basis, the better. So it permeates capital, absolutely permeates capital, and capital is power. So I guess you've got me there. That's exactly where the problem is starting to stem from.
So we count what counts. By the looks of current capital structures, products, it doesn't look like women or people of colour count, or the cultures that we create. Now, I've been talking to a number of private equity firms in the last couple of months, and I'm not raising money at the moment. They're talking to me about various different things, but it's interesting to see their perceptions of the businesses that they want to get involved in. And there are very few that talk about culture. And I think actually we should be investing capital in cultures, because we shouldn't just be looking at how things are done. Or sorry, what is that? It's how things are done. So what's the output? What's the impact? If we talk about talent, people don't leave jobs, people leave cultures, people leave toxic environments. We need to empower and capitalize those leaders that create environments in which their people, in which their teams can succeed. They're really focused on people, they're really focused on purpose. We recruit, reward, retain that talent. We build those organizations. Everyone succeeds, and those investors reap the rewards. So invest in capital. Invest the capital in culture.
I'm going to pick someone in the audience, and they may or may not like this, but the question we've had about culture and sharing that power and building inclusive leadership. This discussion is something I know someone in our audience, Peter Holt-Nielsen, who's also part of our GBF Global Advisors Network. So Peter, if you're still there and you haven't run away from the discussion, Peter was the former CEO of Novozymes and also part of the advisory group of Novo Holdings. And Peter's been a deep reflector on SDGs and sustainability especially, but also brings a unique lens sitting in Denmark, one of what we'd call more progressive countries. Peter, as a CEO and as a leader, how have you, some of the reflections you're hearing here on the conversation, culture, how capital really plays a lot of the difference towards bringing inclusive leadership. Did you want to share some comments and thoughts?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's a really big question, and I don't think there's a quick answer to it. I prefer to think about the theme that you've teed up here as inclusion rather than diversity. Somehow, I think when you sit there in the CEO office, diversity very often gets into a system of ticking off boxes and is as if there is a perfect way of doing it. Whereas inclusion is something that, to me, at least with my limited understanding of the English language, is something that has more cultural roots. And I think leadership has always been about being the what was the word before, the captain, the extrovert and the optimist. But leadership is also about creating that cultural framework for a company and putting the company on the right cultural development track. And I think that has to be a balance between what you want to do with the company strategically and the different national cultures you're working in as a company. I've always been a big fan of, or a big promoter of including the different elements of the societies that we're working in, to make sure that you have a broad coverage of the cultures you're working in, and that's both gender, but certainly also ethnic, religious groups that plays a role. So I've tried to work with inclusiveness, and when I think about it, I think leadership has always been about understanding your own biases. I think the good leaders are those who understand their own biases and are able to navigate those biases and not let themselves influence too much by these biases. Of course, we all do it to some extent. But if you can kind of navigate them, you'll be better off. And I think that also goes when it comes to inclusiveness. I think most people, including myself, have certain biases when it comes to certain people, and you have to navigate that. You have to get beyond that. You have to create leadership teams where you have a natural, where you have a selection of people that will collectively bypass or navigate these cultural biases. So certainly leadership and culture is strongly linked, and inclusiveness and culture is also strongly linked. I think we sometimes in these conversations do forget that we all a part of a society also. We not just work, we also a part of a society. We have our friends, we have our networks, we have our families, we have kids to take care of, and so on and so on. And all these, if you like, externalities are strongly influenced by the societies we live in. So in my country, where Novozymes has its headquarters and where I've spent most of my life, it's very easy for women to get an education. It's very easy to have childcare because it's all public. And yet it's very difficult to break the glass ceilings in most companies. So it's not a given that these, at least the Nordic countries, even though they are very egalitarian, they are actually not doing particularly well when it comes to getting more diversity. Now I use the word, but to include, have more gender inclusion at the in companies and on the executive levels. Some of that comes back to the way we talk about leadership, the way we develop managers. I've spent an awful lot of time, and let me close with that, on actually trying to modify our training programs. A lot of the training programs were intended to be for everyone, but when you dissected them, they had a lot of masculinity to them. There was a lot of programs where the further you could walk, the higher you could climb, the more you could do, the faster you could bicycle, the better you were as a leader. And it's just a bunch of crap. So try to level these things and making sure that it becomes more inclusive actually did change the picture in the company I worked for. And we went from having about 6-7% of the VPs being women to going closer to 1/3 and actually pushing towards 40% within 3-4 years. So I think it can actually be done, but you have to worry about your personal biases. Let me close there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, for coming in and very impromptu putting you on the spot there to share your thoughts. I did think that part on understanding on our own biases. I posted a link on the chat box of a TED Talk by one of the Netflix head of people speakers, which talks about how all of us actually have a blind spot. And it's recognizing our own biases is quite important. It may not be gender, it may be sexuality, it may be religion, it may be ethnicity. I think that was a powerful point, Peter, and also your thoughts on inclusion. I would love to bring in Anna Campbell, who is also with us here in New Zealand, who had an excellent question, because Global BioFund does focus on female entrepreneurs. And I'd love you to pose that question, Anna, on your thoughts, or a question for us to discuss about why just focus on female entrepreneurs, what your thoughts are on that.
So my question comes from an idealistic point of view, and it's not that I have a problem, but I struggle with the fact that if I want a capital raise, and that might be my best opportunity, is to go down that path, when I believe that our business should be able to stand on its own 2 feet and go down any path. And so my question is, how do we really break the barriers in terms of actually getting greater representation within capital investment communities at the decision-making level? And I really enjoyed Monique's capital as a proxy for power comment before, because I think this is the shift that we need to start seeing, is that you actually walk into a room where you're presenting or you're pitching and it's a genuinely diverse audience. And what are the big things that we can do to force our way to those kinds of diverse capital communities?
Monique, did you want to take that question first?
Well, I think let's think about the system from which those folks come. Largely, the investment banks are the feeders to which private equity and venture capital source their talent. So if we begin at the first step, we have a chicken and egg problem. We want a better thing here, but the problem often begins further up the chain. When you think about where do investment banks go to hire? The elite universities. You can see the overrepresentation of Harvard and Stanford here in the United States and other top business schools. I mean, I went to NYU, which is a feeder school for investment banking, but a lot of the women who were in my class did not go into investment banking. They went into other careers that were, in some senses, more hospitable, though they have their own challenges. These other businesses are not necessarily that much worse when you get to the top. I mean, the CEO's named John is already, that's across industries, but investment banks have been a particularly inhospitable place. And if that's your pipeline to private equity and venture capital jobs, and then, you know, to be well capitalized coming off of a platform as a first-time fund manager, unless you already have wealth, where would you get the wealth, and where will you be able to convince even the institutional LPs who are going to be your investors as anchor investors? The fund managers have the same problem as women founders. We haven't fixed it if we have a bottleneck in getting women to be at the table, to be making the decisions in the venture capital private equity space. So, I mean, I think that the challenges begin in so many different places. When we think about the systems change needed, we have a pipeline problem, but we have a pipeline problem because we have a structural problem, how investment banks hire. How do we get the women funded who want to be fund managers? How do we get the Black people and the Indigenous people and Latinx founders, whether they want to be founders or managers, properly capitalized? We have a trust problem in this system because of who is deemed risky that we talked about before. So, you know, it's a big question, and I appreciate you naming it, because I think this is something that we all need to notice and say, what must change? If we want change here in a system, where does it lead from? What's the source, and how do we fix it at the root? I don't have the answers, but I think the investment banks have been challenged for a long time, and there's programs that are focusing on diversity in that particular pipeline problem, at least here in the United States. I don't know if there's analogs elsewhere. An organization that I am an alum of, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, SEO, is how I got my start in the industry. That internship, if I had not had it, I don't think I would have been recruited to be in the financial services sector. And again, I was often the only. So I got lucky, but it shouldn't be because I'm lucky. There are loads of other smart Black people, smart Black women who I went to school with and who went to other universities who were not as lucky. It should not have to be about luck.
And I'll just add another element, Andrew. I was going to direct the question to you anyway. Nina, who is one of the leaders of Enterprise Angels, an angel investment network in New Zealand, she's put a really good comment there about unconscious biases as well. Because I've also, as building a first-time fund, I think I've definitely found the challenge is partly pipeline, but there's also conscious and unconscious bias when you look at limited partners or people you're investing in from the fund. But that point on how do people really think about unconscious bias, and I'd love you to probably share some thoughts on how you think about that.
Sure. Initially, though, let me address or start with Anna's question.
Yeah.
And referring more to the way she wrote it than the way she said it. The idea that we are in a biased capital framework, which I do agree, as I said before, there's a very interesting obvious answer here. Again, going back to the tenet, let's try and just do what's obvious. The obvious tenet here is that at the moment, female entrepreneurs are under-supported quite dramatically. Ipshita has the figures to her fingertips, but the ratio of capital going into female-led companies is a small minority of all capital. And the premise should be that women are equally talented. And I dare say more talented, and this is a little bit contentious, but I think they're more talented in a post-pandemic world or in a pandemic world, as we might look at our country leaderships around the world and how they have dealt with the pandemic. And that, I think, is symptomatic of the way that women are superior in that circumstance. So if women are under-supported in capital and they're equally talented, that's a great place to invest. Sorry, just logically, financially, wow, you've got a pool of capital that's being ignored or neglected. It's equally talented. Oh, I should be in there. And that's exactly the way I think. And more to the point, it's the way Ipshita and GBF have been thinking. And it comes all the way back to your question, Anna. if you don't think it is valid to invest or to target female leadership or female entrepreneurship specifically, just do it from a financial basis. Just sort of say, oh, that'd be a clever investment thesis. So that's where I wanted to go, Ipshita. Thank you.
I think there's certainly a place, and we should be supporting funds that are specifically focusing on women in leadership positions. We can't just let this happen and hope it does. We've seen how quickly political idiots in power can shift the political system, the social system, and can go back to so-called traditional roles. You know, tradition is just peer pressure from our ancestors. Those things are outdated, they are archaic. And to quote a wonderful speaker and an inspirational woman called Monique Aiken, we need to raise the floor, not just the ceiling.
A lovely way to share that thought, Claire. I think, and I think there's more to this discussion, Anna, which we will pick up after this panel discussion too. I will hand to Surya, our MC. If you, Surya, wanted to share some of your thoughts and reflections from our discussion today, but also some questions. I know we had so many questions lined up and we haven't got to them. Some questions that you want our audience to reflect on or think about even after this panel.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ipshita. Yeah, so, one question that always comes to me, you also mentioned this before, we discussed about it before the panel. It's been 111 years since we have been celebrating our Women's Day. And this is the 111th year. But I don't know how much we were able to make changes from the past and now. There are still a lot of room for development. And that's what I see here that is being addressed. And of course, I see that bias is something that we definitely need to address, and how we can support women who are being in such a position is something that we should think about.
Yep. No, thanks, Surya. And I'll ask each of our panelists in 30 seconds, share one final thought or takeaway for our discussion today, from our discussion today. So I'll go reverse. I'll ask Claire if you want to share your 30 seconds of wisdom.
Wow, that long, eh? I think it's clear that culture is really important to us all, the culture that we build in our organizations and the culture that we embrace around us, and that we should be focusing on investment in that and the impact that it derives in both on return on investment, but return in our communities and the world as a whole. So we've got to think about our purpose. And we should be using our power, our privilege, our platforms for good.
Andrew, would you like to go next? Yep.
Oh, sure. That's a really big thing to try and summarize in 30, but the thing that you people have helped me to learn in recent times is that importance of power and how it is wielded isn't too strong a word, how it flows, how it exists in a room. And I guess I would advocate that we should all, and maybe I'm speaking to myself mostly, we should all, when we walk into a, first of all, feel the power, feel where the power is flowing, because if you're caught up in it, if you are in that room trying to achieve something, you will be part of that tussle, you'll be part of that flow. But if you can quietly observe and see where that power is flowing, then you can actually, a little bit like judo, I expect, I've never done it, but I expect if you know where that power is flowing, you can actually work it and work with it and help it to come to a different conclusion than if you enter it and engage in it.
And Monique, I think we've already got some really lovely things from raising the floor to another one that I was a capital is a proxy for power.
Well, I have one last one then that you can add to the list. And this is not mine language, but I heard this from a pension fund trustee. And as a former person who was in the trading floor in the markets, it really sums it up for me. We all need to go long the future and short the past. And that can start today. You know, what does it mean to go long the future? What is our future, and what is this future we can collectively imagine? Well, that future needs to center women, center the marginalized, center the most historically excluded in wherever your geography is, and design for them. That's what it means to raise the floor. And, you know, thinking about climate, thinking about this collective future that we have, and we won't have one if we don't center climate. There's a great video that was put out by UNDP. I don't know if you have seen it. It's basically hashtag don't choose extinction. Do whatever it is that requires us not to choose extinction. It's related from a climate perspective, but who are the customers of the future? Where are the populations growing? If we design for today, we actually should be designing for like a 28-year-old Chinese man, because that's the median human today. 10 years ago, National Geographic did a study to find the Earth's most typical person, and they found him. His name was Mu Li, and he was based in China. So if we're thinking about who's the future, 2015, that person would likely be African and probably a woman. So if we're not designing for a future that serves and meets the needs of those people, what future are we designing? And we won't have one again if we don't focus on the climate aspects. So Ipshita asked us to get a list, some resources. So I'll just put some in the chat, some books that have been really meaningful to me and articles that help shape my thinking. So for those who want to read what I've read, maybe that will be useful to you all. But let's just say, let's go along the future together.
And with that, I'll pull back the baton for all of us who are in this call. Firstly, thank you for investing your time. I think I'm definitely zoomed out with discussions and the number of International Women Day panels that there have been. Grateful that you've decided to come to this one. And I hope you've picked or got something valuable out of it. But for all of us in this virtual room to think, what is our role towards inclusion and impact? So what do you do in your everyday job as an entrepreneur, as a scientist, as a leader, whichever hat you wear? What are we doing to address some of the ideas and challenges that have been discussed today? So with that, do stay in touch. I'm sure we will cross paths soon, if not in the next few hours. But it has been a lovely discussion. Thank you to the panelists and the audience for a very engaging discussion.